Reason with Science, where we dive into the big questions that shape how we think and understand the nature. In this episode, we talk with Kevin Mitchell. He is an associate professor of genetics and neuroscience at Trinity College Dublin, where he investigates how genetic variations influence neural wiring, cognition, and conditions like autism and schizophrenia. Kevin is also the author of Innate, How the Wiring of Our Brains Shapes Who We Are, and Free Agents, How Evolution Gave Us Free Will. Here we discuss the laws of biology and the nature of free will. Kevin also shares insights on agency as a defining feature of life, the meaning of self, and the evolution of perception, from nature versus nurture to the essence of consciousness. This conversation offers a deep look at what makes us who we are. So, let's get started. Hi, Kevin. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Jitendra. Thanks very much.
So, Free Agents, your new book. I finished listening it yesterday. It's a fantastic book with all the different, I would say, concepts, ideas about biology. But I would start with, before we talk about free will and your stance on it, I would start with something interesting that you highlight in the book, which is, as a biochemist, it was quite interesting. Like this notion is there. So you write that biology is not just applied chemistry or applied physics. The components of living systems obey the laws of physics, but the existence and behavior of living organisms cannot be deduced from those laws alone. So here I think you're on to something interesting. So let's kind of start from there. Like, what do you mean by this?
Well, that's a really fundamental aspect of the book, and it's an aspect of many people's thinking. Although I guess some biology kind of gets bogged down in what people have called physics envy, where the idea is like you have to be simplifying things, reducing them to the lowest sort of physical levels in order to be producing the most scientific explanation. And I think that is just misguided, actually. I think that biology, as you've quoted there, is not just complicated physics. There are principles at work in biological systems that are not derivable from the basic laws of physics. There's principles of self-maintenance and persistence through time and selection and organizational top-down causation and so on that are perfectly naturalizable. They're not mystical or magic. They don't override the lower laws of physics, but you can't from physics alone deduce them, and you can't just from understanding electromagnetism and gravity and this sort of billiard ball idea of physical forces. That's just not enough to explain what living systems are. They're organisms are organized. And biology is a science of organization, first and foremost. And, if we forget that, then we miss the point. We miss what it is that distinguishes living things from non-living things.
Yeah, but our textbook knowledge is about reductionism, right? Everything that comes from matter, which is, of course, it's loosely defined, but we can say that the matter kind of follows the laws of physics and gives rise to chemistry and so on, right?
The matter doesn't, what happens in living systems, there's no new physical laws. There's no violation of the existing laws. There's just some additional levels of constraint that the systems are organized in order to do things. And, it's true that it's kind of weird. Like it's an implicit view in most biology. Like a lot of biologists are trying to figure out, what is this bit doing? What is that bit doing? What's this, what is the ribosome doing? What is the cell membrane doing? What is the liver doing? What is this bit of the brain or that bit of the brain? It's all basically functional, organizational kind of thinking. It's systems thinking, really. And yet, at the same time, I suppose really with the advent and the rise of molecular biology, there was a drive to explain those systems in terms of what their lower level components are doing, right? Which, in a sense, that focus almost eliminates the systems aspect of it, right? The thing that you were trying to explain just sort of evaporates almost, or goes out of focus as the object of explanation. And instead, people think, well, here's this complicated thing, and I've explained all the bits and how all the bits work. Well, therefore, I have explained what the whole thing is doing. Well, no, you haven't, right? You need to actually look at the systems level to get that understanding.
Yeah, I mean, I think it all goes back to that Maxwell's demon kind of analogy, right? Like where he said that if I have all the particles in the universe and I have some sort of supercomputer, and if we can just simulate it, we can get all the actions, everything in the universe, right?
Yeah,
So
that one that was Laplace's demon, actually.
Laplace's, I'm sorry,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. Maxwell's demon was another demon. There's demons all over the place. So Laplace's demon. I mean, this gets to the heart of the issue as to why you can't just go down to the lowest level and explain everything, because the lowest level has some indeterminacy to it. And if that's the case, then the details that you get at that lowest level, plus the laws of physics, just don't dictate exactly what the system is going to do. They underdetermine how the system is going to evolve through time. And that opens the door for higher order organization to have some causal power in determining the way the system is organized. Because, and this is key, this relies on selection, right? This is something that emerges through time. It doesn't just emerge magically. It requires, in a sense, selection to do some design work to pick the functionalities, the systems that are organized in one way when they could have been organized in other ways. That's the crucial bit, right? There was nothing deterministic about it. There's a system that's like this, but it could have been like that. But selection says, you know what? This one is good. This one has some functionality to it, and I'm going to keep that one. And it may be, natural selection is the obvious sort of mechanism for that. But even before that, even before we had natural selection acting on genomes with organisms that have, generational reproduction, there's just a kind of selection for stable persistence of complex systems. So a system could be organized in any of many, many different ways. And some of those organizations are self-reinforcing. And those are the ones we see, right? The ones that aren't self-reinforcing just dissipate. So even just in terms of physics, right? Selection for some kind of persistence of complex systems that form this network of self-reinforcing constraints is probably, where the origin of life comes from. Is that it's just persisting sets of, in this case, chemical reactions that reinforce each other. But the point again is that it's selection of among many possibilities, and then that configuration is just reinforced through time.
Yeah, so I mean, probably we can just talk a little bit about why this bit is important, especially when we want to, talk about a bigger concept like free will, right?
Yeah.
So here we are kind of trying to discuss that. So in one view where everything, let's say the matter and physics is fundamental, and everything else is just applied, applied chemistry, applied biology, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So in this view, we kind of have to explain that at some point, these kind of qualitative properties they arise, right?
Yes.
But then still those properties we should be able to explain at the particle level, etc.
Well. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just about to say, but in your perspective, we have to go at the systems level to kind of to explain it. It's not like you are invoking something supernatural that's right. Right.
Yeah, and the key for me is, so some people would say there's this concept of emergence, right, where people have, on the one hand, the idea of reductionism, where all the important causal principles and interactions happen at the lowest level, and whatever the macro state of a system is, it's just explained completely by what was happening at the lowest levels. Right? And of course, it's true that at any moment, the macro state, a particular macro state, has some particular micro state instantiation, obviously. But it's not necessarily true that the way a system is organized at the macro level derives from everything that's happening at the lowest level. You may need some other kinds of explanation for why a system is organized the way that it is. And this idea of emergence is often appealed to, but I find it sort of difficult because it's a little bit fuzzy. And it feels like you're getting something for free, right? It feels like a free lunch, like you've organized some stuff in a certain way and magically this functionality emerges, right? That doesn't seem right. It just feels like you're getting something cheaper than you should, or even completely free. So my view of that is that actually a lot of evolution is not inventive. It's not creating new functionalities. It's finding them, right? It's exploring a kind of a space of ways that systems could be organized. And it's happening on organizations that have some functionality, but in an abstract kind of a sense, right? So for example, you could build, say, an oscillator from all kinds of different components. You can have genetic oscillators, neural oscillators, obviously electrical, electronic components, whatever, right? The important design principles, what makes something an oscillator, kind of a negative feedback, mutual negative feedback, say, is just a principle that just holds. It's not derived from the laws of physics. It's not created by evolution. It's just found. It's just a mathematical truth almost. And there are lots of, I think, principles like that evolution finds. There are certain organizations that are stable and persistent and generate their own sets of constraints through time, just because that organization mathematically does that, right? And of course, those are the ones that we see. All the ones that didn't do that, we just never see them because they don't exist for any length of time. So I think we can get away from the idea, first of all, that everything, the low-level physics is the fundamental level. I think there's equally fundamental mathematical principles of systems organizations that cannot be derived from anything in terms of physics. They just hold. And at the same time, it gets you away from the idea that life is like magically producing these things, when in fact it's exploring a space of pre-existing possibilities of organization, and it's keeping the ones that do good things.
Yeah, let me ask you this thing. So I'm not sure if you're aware of Michael Levin's work.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a couple of conversations with him, and he talks about this collective intelligence of cells, right?
Yeah.
Where so are you so in this case, I mean, if we think of that, like different cells, like he also talks about cybernetics, where it's that kind of function. The emergence is that kind of unification in a way. So what's your stance on this? I mean, do you think that this is the kind of thing that we are talking about, where it's like mathematically it just comes together and brings a new functions in the...
Yeah, well, first of all, I think there are lots of fields of mathematics and systems thinking that we can apply to biological systems very productively. So things like cybernetics and dynamical systems theory and information theory and networks and hierarchy, all of those have some interesting abstract principles at play, which are very interesting. And in terms of, Mike Levin's work, in particular, one of the things that he talks about a lot is the idea that when we have a multicellular organism, each of those cells has, in a sense, the capacity to be an individual agent. Or at least if you think of them as evolved from single-celled organisms, then in a multicellular organism, actually, I think what's happening is that each of those cells gives up some of its agency, right? They stop following just their own goals. They cede some of their autonomy to the organism as a whole. And in fact, most of our somatic cells, all of our somatic cells, have ceded their reproductive rights to the germline, right? They say, okay, well, I'm a skin cell. I'm never going to have the opportunity to to have new offsprings, but I'm here, and my genome's going to get passed on regardless because it's shared with the germline. So we can think about sort of a hierarchy of cybernetic systems that have goals, that have, in a sense, various variables that they're trying to optimize over at any given point. And we can think of multicellular organisms as collectives of agents like that are all working in unison because they've evolved to do so. And because there are some control systems that are system-wide, organism-wide, that enable them to do that. And of course, the nervous system is precisely that, right? That's what it is. It's a control system to make sure all your different cells are on the same page, as it were, and all doing the same thing for the good of the whole organism.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so what do you think about the simple? So when you said that the emergence gives you free lunches, right? Means there is something, but then there is still a kind of thinking of, let's say, a progression of, evolution of the properties. But on the other hand, when it comes to these kind of abstract principles, how do you look at that progression then?
Well, so you can think about it in terms of, well, first of all, the lineage that I trace, the story that I trace in the book Free Agents, is along the lineage that goes from the origin of life to human beings, and it looks like a line because that's the bit that I focus on. Of course, evolution is really a net, right? And it goes in all kinds of different directions, and many of those directions don't have increasing complexity and increasing agency and so on. So that's the first thing. The other thing is that thinking in terms of control systems, you can see a progression that goes from sort of pre-wiring some control policies that are quite reactive, where you can have an organism that is responding to things in its environment, not simply, because even single-celled organisms have to integrate multiple signals at once, right? But they're doing so based on these fairly hardwired control policies that are configured into their biochemistry. So they're not predicting anything, right? They're not looking to the future. They're pretty much reacting to the here and now. They integrate over time, but it's over a period of seconds, right, at most, probably. So they have a limited capacity to control what happens in the world and what happens within themselves over a certain kind of a time frame, right? But as you get more and more complicated, you start to get organisms that are internalizing aspects of information in the world, representing things internally in their own brains, in their own minds, and using that information not just to react to things, but to anticipate things. Right? So they're starting to know that something is going to happen in the future because it always has happened, like with circadian rhythms, for example, where it's an anticipatory system. It's very powerful for the organism to be able to do that, to react to regularities in the environment. But then you can develop, higher levels that give even greater autonomy, greater control, greater predictive power of the future, and that can include things like predicting, where something's going to be because you've learned that it's where something else is, right? So if you're a fish and you've learned that plankton go up to a certain level of light in the sea, right? And you can say, right, so at noon, these guys are going to be up there, and you can go and find them based on where the light is, not based on where the plankton are directly. So you can get systems that enable, first of all, greater learning, greater memory, sort of building up the knowledge of the world, building up models of the world, models of yourself. And then you get to a stage where you can predict the outcomes of actions. Okay, so this becomes really important because any organism is facing some situation in the world. It has some internal states that it wants to be at a certain level, right? Some variables that are good. Those are the homeostatic set points that it wants to be at. And if it's not at those levels, it wants to do something about it, right? A lot of that is quite rapid and immediate and reactive, but in more complicated organisms, it gets more predictive and anticipatory and proactive. and of course, much, much more complex and layered than all these sort of goals that are layered on top of each other, that altogether give a greater degree of insulation from the environment, from the exigencies of the environment, of just what's happening out there. You can insulate yourself from that by planning, right? So you don't just wait for things to happen in the environment, you make them happen, right? Or you avoid places where you know bad things are going to happen. And all of that is just better and better control, right? So it's just, you can think of cognition in that way, in the service of action, in the service of knowing what's the best thing to do, but in an increasingly proactive way that as you get to creatures like humans, that planning extends almost, for us, indefinitely in time. I mean, we can think about things thousands of years from now. We can plan for things that have outcomes that will affect our descendants, or the future of the planet. We don't usually, but we could. So yeah, that's how I see the evolution of those systems, as just increasingly sophisticated control systems.
Yeah, and what do you mean by information here?
Well, so information, it's such a tricky one, right? So information is the arrangement of some physical system that could have been some other way. Right? So for a living organism, what is required is that it's information about something that the organism cares about. It's meaningful information. And the meaning is the really key thing. So for a simple organism, say a bacterium, it's sitting there, it's in an environment, it's trying to keep all its chemical reactions going, right? It's trying to keep itself organized in the pattern that makes it itself. And so it needs to take in energy, because that organization is improbable in a thermodynamic sense. It just requires energy to keep it like that. And that creates a problem for the organism, because the energy might run out and it might need to, say, reconfigure itself to use a different food source. Right? Basic kind of changes in gene expression to use, say, lactose instead of glucose or something like that. But it may also exhaust all of the food resources in its environment, or it may replicate so much that there's so much toxic, waste around, and there's so much other competition that actually it needs to move, right? That's the solution to that problem, is to move somewhere else. And then it becomes really useful to know what's out in the world to guide where you should move. I mean, you can just move at random. Many organisms actually do that, where it's like, anywhere else is better than here. I'll take my chances and I'll move at random until I find some nice place. But many systems don't do that. They take information from the outside world and they use that to inform or guide which way they should move. So the information in that sense is a different kind of causation from just physics or chemistry. So you've got an organism. What makes it an organism is that it has a barrier with the outside world. In a simple bacterium, it's a cell wall and a cell membrane, but it has an inside and an outside, and they're not in causal thermodynamic equilibrium with each other. So physical causes outside are mostly blocked from actually affecting what goes on inside. Instead, what these organisms have is some sensors. They have some receptors on their surface that can bind some molecule on the outside. And when that happens, you don't get a transfer of matter or really a transfer of energy. What you get is an informational change. You get a change in the conformation of the inside of the molecule that signals something to the rest of the system that has, some response to that signal. And so information and meaning in that sense is the key element, right? That's what life runs on, is the meaning of things like that. And in that sense, in the simplest sense, the meaning of a signal for a bacterium is not, it doesn't mean, oh, there's lactose over here, or there's glucose over here, or there's a dangerous chemical over there. It just means approach or avoid. Right? That effectively, it's a pragmatic kind of a meaning. It's not separately apprehended in a cognitive sense. But as you get to more complicated organisms, they, especially ones that develop nervous systems, they do develop this kind of decoupling of signals from action. So in a bacterium, they're pretty close together. There's still some interesting integration that's quite holistic. but there aren't multiple levels of that. It's all kind of happening at one level. But when you get to the evolution of nervous systems, you have sensory neurons and motor neurons, and some simple organisms couple them quite closely. But as nervous systems got more complex, you got these intervening layers. Now you can get some really interesting integration happening where it's not obligately coupled to a sort of a reflexive response. It's a sort of an internal cognitive arena now, where these different bits of information are operated over all at once. And the reason to do that is because it's no longer possible to just hardwire in a bunch of control policies to isolated stimuli. That won't work. That's not solving the cognitive problem that the organism faces anymore, right? In a complex, dynamic, unpredictable environment where you're going to encounter lots of novel scenarios with many, many variables changing at once, you just can't configure it with pragmatic couplings. You need to have this internal place where you can operate over all those things and weight them relative to each other, figure out, okay, how much good stuff is there over there versus how much bad stuff, and the same comparison over here decides to go left or right. So there's a need for cognition to solve the kinds of problems that those organisms face, which means the development of those cognitive systems is what allows organisms to exploit those kinds of complicated dynamic niches.
Yeah, and probably then let's move from here to your stance on free will. So, because I think it's quite interesting. So, in your case, you think that that's your stance, is that the free will is there, right?
Yes.
But then, what's the borderline? Is there some dissection?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, I use the term free will. It has so much philosophical baggage associated with it that I reserve it for humans, and I'm not going to say bacteria have free will or a dog has free will or anything like that. But we have a more neutral term, which is just agency. The idea that an organism can be somehow in charge of its own actions, right? It can do various things in the world, and what it does is at some level up to the whole organism as an entity, as a self. And that gets away from a reductive way of thinking, which is to say that an organism is just being pushed around by its parts. Right? And even in a bacterium, even a single bacterium responding to some sugar in the world, you can trace out a biochemical pathway that goes from a receptor to some signal transduction proteins to phosphorylation of the flagellum that makes it rotate one way or another. And you could say, look, it's literally being pushed around by its parts. It's just a reflexive stimulus response system. And even there, I think that's not right, because actually bacteria are integrating multiple signals at once. They're integrating them in a context-dependent manner, depending on the temperature and the osmolarity and cell crowding and all kinds of other factors. And crucially, in terms of the history, their recent history, right? That's what enables them to know if they're going up a gradient or down a gradient, is they do a kind of a biochemical gain control of their system, which effectively means that they will go up a gradient of something that is good for them, right? So it's a historical, integrative, holistic kind of thing that's happening, and I would call that an exercise of at least a basic proto-agency. Now, as it goes up, gets more and more complicated. As I said, you get further and further away from reactive kind of dynamics towards much more proactive, more autonomous, insulated kinds of behavior through time. And that's where I'm much happier to say, that a dog has real agency. It does things because it wants to do things, and so on. So when it comes to the free will debate, there's lots of different levels and criticisms of the idea of free will in humans. And of course, if you just start with an absolutist idea that we're only free, it only counts as free will if we're absolutely free from any prior cause whatsoever. That's just a nonsensical notion, right? It's completely incoherent, because what would that entail? It would mean that an organism is doing things just for no reasons, right? Because if it wants to do something, that's a prior cause. If it knows something about the world, that's a prior cause. If it has a goal to do something, that's a prior cause, right? So any kinds of constraints on our freedom that come from our past experience and that derive from our future directed goals, those are what make us selves. That's the only thing that makes us who we are, or an organism at all, through any length of time. So the first thing I would say is that if you set the bar up here, way up here, with this absolutist free will, that's just not something that a living organism could have, because it wouldn't continue to be a living organism if it behaved in that way. So I just sort of reject that premise. It just makes no sense. So what I wanted to do in the book was actually ask, well, let's just try to naturalize this idea. What does it mean for an organism to act? What does it mean for an organism to do something in the world, right? That's the central difference between living and non-living things. Non-living things don't do anything, but living things do. And so where could that power come from? And where could the control come from to make happen in the world what an organism wants to happen? And typically the philosophical debate starts with, oddly, the premise of determinism, physical determinism, the idea that the laws of physics, which we discussed earlier, just completely dictate what's going to happen. And, they don't. The laws of physics just don't do that. They absolutely show that what happens in a system is underdetermined, both at quantum levels and, I would argue, at classical levels as well. And there's a whole sort of realm of interesting argument around that. But certainly, I would say physics hasn't proven that all of that is deterministic. So then you have a different problem. Well, that means if the evolution of a system is underdetermined, which means the future is radically open, many things could happen. Well, then how does an organism ensure that only one thing happens, the thing that it wants to happen, right? Now it's a control question. It's not where does the freedom come from? The freedom just exists in the universe. It comes for free. The question is control. That's the will, right? So what does willing mean in an organism? And I think you can just naturalize that by saying, look, here's some control systems. Here's an organism like, say, a C. elegans. It has a system for monitoring its internal states, for monitoring what's out in the world, for integrating lots of different signals at once, for weighing things over different goals, depending on what its internal states are, depending on what the options are. Is there food available? Is there a mating opportunity available? Is there a threat in the environment? And to do that, it has to holistically integrate those things, as we mentioned a moment ago. And that process is the organism deciding what to do. And in C. elegans, there aren't many things it can do. It can move forwards, it can move backwards, it can mate. It has a very limited action repertoire to choose from. It's very predefined, but it still is doing the choosing. And that is a holistic, integrative exercise, right? So when you get to more complicated things, the repertoire of actions increases. And, for us, it's basically open-ended, right? It's almost infinite repertoire of actions that we could do, but we still have to choose one of them. Right? We still have to do the basic process is the same, right? We have to integrate what's out in the world. What are our goals? What's our internal state? What would we like it to be? What would we like the world to be like? That's basically what we're doing. When we're choosing an action, people think of it as this internal thing, but no, we want the world to be a certain way, and we want ourselves in the world to be a certain way, and so we act to make it that way. So we have causal power in the world, which derives from the fact that we have causal potential packed into us through evolution and through learning. Right? That's we've been paying attention to things in the world, how they work, what are good things to do and bad things to do in certain situations, and that knowledge about how the causal relations in the world, knowledge is power, literally, and that gives us the potential to exercise causality in an effective way in the world, or at least that's the way that I see it. So for me, the question of free will then can be naturalized in that way. That doesn't get around all of the arguments against it. And there's sort of two main arguments that I would go to. One of them is about mental causation, and the other one is about biological fatalism, the idea that we can do what we want, but those intentions come from somewhere else. So maybe if it's okay with you, I'll talk about the mental causation thing.
Sure, let's do it.
Great. Okay, so we talked a little earlier about the idea of why cognition exists. It's a solution to a problem that's facing an organism in a complex, dynamical world. If it didn't exist, we'd have to invent it, basically. It's the only way to solve these kinds of problems is to centralize the information about them and to operate on that information in some central space, and then to execute an action. And the reason why, when things get really, really complicated, why we need a system like that is because there's just too many parameters, there's too many variables, and there's too many combinations of variables to hardwire or hard code an appropriate optimal response to every new thing that you would see. Right? You couldn't do that. There's just not enough information in the genome or in the nervous system to do that. So instead, we have to use a judgment, right? We have to use a system that evaluates these things, and that just is cognition. And the objects of cognition are objects in the world, their goals, their beliefs, their desires. They're mediated by neural firings, but they're not reducible to neural firings. So one thing I really want to argue against is the idea that all of that cognitive stuff, we don't really need it. If we're explaining it, we're neuroscientists, we can just explain it by these neurons firing and those neurons firing and so on. It's a big electrical machine. And it looks like we get a complete explanation of things because we can go into an animal and we can drive a behavior. Even in humans, you can drive some behaviors or percepts, if you electrically stimulate parts of the brain and so on. So it feels like in neuroscience, we're getting this almost like complete explanation down at the level of the neural instantiation. But actually, just because there's some power to manipulate the system at that level doesn't mean it's the right level to explain what the system is doing. It explains what's happening. It explains how the system does it and the machinery it relies on to do it. But that's not the same thing. It's not identical to what the system is doing. And what the system is doing is cognition. And cognition really depends on the meaning of those neural patterns. And I think one way to defend that is by asking, well, in a system like that, like our brains, where's the causal sensitivity? What is the system sensitive to? And when we look at that, what we see is that the system is sensitive to patterns of neural activity, where there are higher order patterns among populations of neurons, say, but they're not sensitive to the details of the firing of every single neuron in that population, because those details are averaged out, they're coarse-grained over by another population that's monitoring this one. Right? So this system, this population here, encodes some information in the firing of its neurons, but that information is coarse-grained over. It's by another system that's looking at it, that's monitoring it. And what this system up here cares about is whether the broad pattern corresponds to A or B, but not whether it corresponds to A prime or A double prime or A triple prime or whatever, right? There's lots of details, lots of patterns, microstates correspond to A, and lots of other microstates correspond to B. And this bit of the system doesn't care whether it only cares if they're A or B, not the details. And A or B, those population level patterns mean something. Those are the things that mean there's an object out in the world. There's a face in the world. There's a threat. There's there's a goal. There's a motivational state, hunger, whatever, right? So those are the things that the system operates on. And if you change those things, you change what happens. But if you change a lot of the details, you don't. And so that's why I think it's right to say that cognition is real and it has real causal power, that in a way gets beyond this worry that it seems sort of mystical to say, well, wait a minute, how can an immaterial thought be pushing stuff around, right? I mean, this was sort of Descartes' big challenge that was, well, it was the challenge that was presented to him by Elizabeth, Princess of Bohemia, who was one of his correspondents, where, Descartes had suggested, well, the mind and the body are separate things, and you have some mental activity. And then, Elizabeth pointed out, well, wait a minute, how does that mental stuff interact with the physical stuff? And he didn't have any, good explanation of it. And the solution is to realize that that mental activity has a physical instantiation, right? Thoughts are not immaterial, they're patterns of neural activity, but they're not just any old patterns of neural activity. They're patterns that mean something. And the reason that they have causal power in the system is based on what they mean. So it flips the idea that you can reduce goals and beliefs and desires and other mental elements to just the firings of neurons. It flips that around and says, no, the firings of neurons only have causal power in the system because they mean these things, because they represent a belief about something in the world, or a desired state, or a goal, or an intention, or whatever. So for me, that's I think it naturalizes, at least, the idea of mental causation. I'm not going to say it solves the problem, because we don't know what mental really means.
Yeah.
But it gives for me a framework in which we can think about it in a non-mystical way.
Yeah. So, I mean, in other words, the system is irreducible, according to you. I mean, it's not like we can really understand what is happening at neuronal level, or something like that.
Well,
But, yeah.
sorry. Yeah.
No, I was about to say that so one thing is that the system is irreducible, and the second thing is that at the basal level, it's all cognition which is going on with so it's trying to solve different.
Yeah. Well, so first of all, yes, you can ask, like, what's the problem facing the organism?
Yeah.
And what is the system doing, right?
Yeah.
Not just what's happening, but what is it doing and why? Yeah. I think that's always a good view to take on biological things, because they're evolved with, and natural selection has done all this design work to give them these functionalities, right? So I don't think it's cognition at the basal level. I think it's cognition at a high level. That's what the systems are doing, and they're supported by these neural mechanisms, which can be configured in ways that enable the organism to really settle what happens. And I would say that sense that cognition is real, that it's not pre-programmable in detail, really means that it's up to the organism. And for us, it's up to us what happens, right? Not in an absolute sense of absolute freedom, but in the sense that we have degrees of freedom. And within those degrees of freedom and constraints that we have to decide what we want to happen. And that really is up to us. That's what the process of cognition is doing. And in a sense, it's computationally irreducible. A lot of it, right? You can't, I think you can't solve these kinds of things with a deterministic algorithmic program in finite time. That's the key point, right? Organisms, they have to average things out. They have to make some, they may have to, make some approximations. They make inferences about what's out in the world based on ambiguous information of changeable things and so on. So to think of this as some algorithmic deterministic physical process that has one inevitable outcome is just wrong. I think that just couldn't be the case. And instead, it's really the organism deciding what it should do.
Yeah, that's exciting. But let's a little bit also talk about your other stance on nature nurture, where I think that we can kind of then take that point of using genetics to try and explain the psychological predispositions that we have.
Yes.
And I think that kind of can explain why, for example, free will may not be let's say deterministic in that way, right?
Yeah. So so I wrote this other book, Innate, a few years ago, which is about how our brains get wired, and how that wiring gives us, in some sense, our innate predispositions, right? Our individual nature is in some part determined by the way our brains actually developed. And, that's it shouldn't be too controversial a stance, because if you think from one species to the next, what determines a species' nature is the way their brains are wired. And that is determined by the way that their genome is, right? And determined is not the right word, because actually it's programmed in a kind of a probabilistic emergent sense, right? Which is interesting, because that adds another level of variability between people. So if we can think, individual animals have chimp nature or tiger nature or salamander nature or whatever it is, including a suite of behavioral capacities and predispositions and tendencies. Well, within each species, there's going to be some variation, some genetic variation that affects how the brain develops. And that's true in humans as well. And that manifests as in some way, our individual natures at a very basic level. And those natures can include, differences in a lot of these parameters of decision making. So, for example, how risk averse you are, or how sensitive to rewards, or how impulsive you are, how long you're willing to wait for a reward, how long you're willing to delay gratification. So all of those kinds of aspects have some neural underpinnings that can vary from individual to individual. And in ways that we can get into the details here in animals, and we can tweak them, we can make them more or less risk averse or more or less impulsive and so on. So we have a decent handle on some of the neuroscience of those decision-making parameters. They're basically cybernetic parameters, actually. And in some way that's less clear, variation in those kinds of parameters relates to these high-level psychological constructs of personality, things like extroversion and neuroticism and conscientiousness and so on, in some way relate to multiple aspects of, say, risk aversion or reward sensitivity. You can think of those in terms of extroversion and impulsivity and so on. So it's true, right, that we're not blank slates, that we do have these psychological predispositions, and that they influence our behavior. That's how we recognize them. That's how they're defined, is that they influence decision making, right? It's our behavior over time. So the first thing to say is what that means is that we are constrained, right? Our freedom is not absolute. I can't just decide to be less risk averse than I am, say, right? So the idea of complete freedom is not real, but we have degrees of freedom within the constraints of our own biology. And one aspect, so first of all, our genetics doesn't determine those traits. It influences those traits, but not 100% deterministically. And then secondly, those traits, those dispositions like extroversion or conscientiousness or impulsivity or whatever, don't determine our behavior at any moment. It's not like the tunings of a robot that right now, at any moment, my behavior is determined by how conscientious I am. It's influenced by that, right? And it's influenced by that more through time, in the sense that the way that I adapt to the world, the habits that I build up, the policies I build up, the sort of overall dispositions I have for ways of behaving across different kinds of scenarios are informed by those initial innate predispositions, but they're shaped by the actual experiences that I have, including experiences that I'm choosing, right? It's not just things happening to me. Those are experiences I'm choosing actively through the exercise of my own agency, through my own life. But in turn, they feed back to shape my habits, to shape my knowledge of the world, to reflect my commitments over time and my plans and agendas that I need to carry out. So the way I see that is that we have this, personality traits that ultimately manifest as character, but that is a trajectory, right? That emerges through our lives in an ongoing kind of a way that is not deterministic, and it's not proximally driving our behavior. It's distally informing the way our character emerges through time. So in terms of the free will debate, some people would say that, we're just acting out the way our brain is wired right now. We're just acting out that programming, and that we had no hand in the way that our brain got wired. because we have these predispositions, because we have all of evolutionary history making human brains the way that they are, and things that happen to us in the womb, and then all these experiences that happen to us, which I think is just an oddly and inaccurately passive view of what we do, right? Of how we live our lives. We're not just reactive stimulus response machines, just reacting to things, whatever is happening to us all the time passively, right? We're choosing things. We're crafting our own environment. We're selecting our own experiences. We're making the world be what we want it to be in the future, so that the experience we'll have when we get there will be like this or like that. Right? So we're making dinner reservations so that when we go to the restaurant, we'll have the experience of eating food. So we do that all the time, and it's much more proactive kind of view of behavior. And what it means is that idea that we have no hand whatsoever in the way that our brains are configured right now, that's just false in my view. But it also gives a window into thinking about behavior that I think is far richer than this view of just binary, momentary decisions, right? A lot of the thought experiments in philosophy, and frankly, a lot of the actual experiments in neuroscience in terms of decision making, are kind of necessarily highly, highly controlled, right? They're really, really controlled environments where, say, an animal can go left or right, and nothing else is changing. All the variables are controlled, so it gives us maximal power to figure out what's going on. But it's a mistake to think that that's how animals actually behave in the world, right? Just reacting, should I go left or right, given the light bulb turned on or it didn't, right? It's such an impoverished view of behavior. Instead, what animals do and what we do in spades is we guide and manage our behavior, suites of behaviors, through time in a very proactive kind of a sense, where we're not just driven by stimuli in the environment, we're accommodating new informational sources, and we're integrating that with everything else that's going on with these long-term projects that we have. And we're deciding in the context of those goals and agendas, what's the best thing that I should do now that I know such and such is the case in the world. That's just a much more agential view of behavior than this immediate, momentary stimulus response kind of thing.
Yeah. So you mean at certain moment we do have certain, like, a degree of free will, but but it's not like that the as in whole. I mean, so there are some predispositions as well, right? Which
absolutely.
comes
So
into
it's
the
not.
picture.
Yeah. So it's not this absolutist view, and it doesn't need to be. That's just not. It's just an incoherent notion, as I argued earlier.
Yeah.
Instead, we have the ability to, pursue our agendas through time, and ultimately, if we go back to what it means to be a living thing, the prime agenda is to keep persisting as yourself, right? To what it means to be a living organism is to be organized like this, which means stopping your bits being organized like anything else or just being disorganized, right? So life is just constraint. It's just continuing to constrain all these bits to be like this through time. And I think, in ourselves, we have the physical constraining our physical bits, but we also have a constraint through time, a continuity through time of our psychology. So our psychological selves, the fact that we have a character that is recognizable, to other people, that has typical ways of behaving that basically make up our character. When some people say, "Oh, I'd rather not act like myself in some particular way," well, okay, maybe fine. You'd like to be able to resist eating that piece of cake or whatever it is, right? But the idea that you'd like to really not act like yourself at all, no, you wouldn't. You'd stop to be yourself. You just wouldn't be you. Right? And in fact, we recognize that in all kinds of pathologies. If people act out of character, very strongly, it's often a sense of some kind of neurological or psychiatric condition, like dementia or depression or schizophrenia or so on. So the continuity of self, both in terms of physical biological systems, but also psychological biographical narrative self, I think is key to what it is that makes us what we are.
Yeah, and some, let's say, someone with the deterministic point of view may say that, okay, as you are saying that the system is irreducible in a way, like there are, particles, chemistry, all the basic units. So that means there is a lot of complexity there. In the same way that there are, even like the different factors that we are involving, like genetics, all the physical factors,
Yeah.
the interactions that we have either at cellular level or at cultural level. So all these factors are also so complex that we can't really account for that, and that's why it appears that it's not deterministic, but at the end it is. So how do
Oh,
you respond to that?
yeah, I mean, that's just
Like
an
it's
argument. It's just an argument with no proof, right? I mean, you can just say, oh, look, it's so complicated, but we think it should still be deterministic. I mean, one argument for me is this idea that the only way that it could be deterministic in terms of having only one behavioral outcome from all this complexity is if the world were, in fact, physically deterministic. There's no other way that could happen because, as I mentioned, it's sort of this computationally irreducible problem, right?
yeah.
That actually, for it to be solved in finite time, requires this integrative coarse graining approximations, the organism just trying to optimize over many variables at once. But there isn't one solution to that. The organism will come to a solution, but it's not predetermined what that is, right? It couldn't be because it just is too computationally complex to work out in a definite kind of a way. So I would say that the idea that those complex behaviors are deterministic boils down to a commitment to physical determinism that even some of those people wouldn't be happy making, right? They wouldn't be happy saying, yes, okay, I actually commit to that because physics doesn't seem to follow that. Right? So that would be my counter to that, is that the complexity is not just apparent, it's real, right? The unpredictability is in principle. It's not just in practice for us as observers. It's that the system, the universe, doesn't know what's going to happen until the organism figures it out. That's the way I would think of it. Yeah. Can I say one other thing too? Because
Yeah, sure.
there's another rejoinder that people would make, which is that you could say, okay, right now, I'm working out what to do, but I do, my brain is physically configured a certain way, and that entails all of my current knowledge, all of my current goals, my beliefs and desires, and so on. So those are going to constrain what I do. And some people would go further and say, and I, usually meaning the conscious self, have no ability to introspect about those reasons. I can act for my reasons, but I don't know where they come from. I don't know why these motivations are the way they are. I just have to follow them blindly like a robot. And I think that's just wrong, right? I mean, we do know where lots of our motivations come from because we have capacities for introspection and metacognition where that allow us to not just do things for reasons, but reason about our reasons, right? Where the reasons themselves, because we have sort of extra levels of the hierarchy, the reasons themselves become objects of cognition up here, where we can sort of, this bit of the brain sort of looks down and goes, oh, I see you have that goal. Yeah, why do you have that goal? Where does this motivation come from? And we can unpack those things. They're not completely mysterious to us. The workings of our mind are not entirely opaque, right? A lot of it just goes on subconsciously and intuitively, which is good because we've done loads of work to figure out how things in the world are. And we offload, as soon as we develop some good policies and habits, we sort of offload that to subconscious intuitive processing. Great, super efficient. But it doesn't mean we can't inspect those or we can't override habits and so on, or we just are baffled by our own motivations all the time. We're not, right? In fact, we tell each other. That's one of the huge benefits of that metacognition and self-consciousness, self-awareness, is that we can communicate. And you mentioned, cultural aspects. Well, culture is the crowning achievement of evolution. It's the thing that gets us. It gave us the escape velocity, right? To escape just biological evolution. Now we're in this world of ideas where we can talk to each other. We can explain our reasons for things, and we can develop the kinds of amazing, technological capacities and societies and civilizations that have enabled us to inhabit every niche on the planet, and even a few niches off planet.
Yeah. I mean, this is where I was about to go, actually, that because for me, it's quite intriguing that we can ask these questions that, as in, like, we are scientists, the existence of science as a discipline itself is quite intriguing. So if we say that it's deterministic, means that either we have it in us as in species, that we are curious in that way, etc. Which, I mean, if we think of apes living in Africa, with that kind of brain, and then from those planes, if we came and we kind of we have something called science, is quite interesting to explain. But on the other hand, with free will, if we accept that the learning part does exist, because that's also another interesting aspect to it, right? Like the learning part is there. That means that slowly, I mean, through of course through the social and cultural phenomena, we can kind of evolve certain agency in a way, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, what's interesting with the evolution of nervous systems is that the individual organism develops the capacity to learn about the world and guide its individual behavior in a more particular way than, say, a bacterium, which is basically acting out evolution's reasons, right? Evolution has done the learning, and it's packed pre-configured those control policies in there. But nervous systems allow individual organisms to do that over a time scale that is many orders of magnitude shorter than what evolution can do. So yeah, learning is hugely powerful. And of course, it becomes amplified. That power is amplified when we have culture, because we can share our learning with each other, and then we can bootstrap our way up by sharing knowledge. And I mean, I think we can think the things these days that were literally unthinkable a century ago, right? There just was no cognitive apparatus in place to allow people to think about the types of things that we can think about now. And our children are thinking about things that are unthinkable to us. Sorry, that came out sounding bad, actually, but they probably are. So I think the cultural evolution is really key. And what you mentioned too, curiosity, right, which is driving a lot of scientific thinking. So curiosity is a wonderful aspect of a control system, where you can have a control system, a cognitive system that takes in some information from the world and has to weigh it up and make some decisions about what to do. But if it's aware that the information has a certain level of certainty to it, it should have a higher or lower confidence in this bit of information versus that one. And it may be in a situation where, given the information it has, it can't actually make a distinction between options A, B, C, or D, right? There's not enough information to say which one of those would be more beneficial. Then there can be a drive to get more information, right? And that infotaxis, as it's called, is a key element of what makes biological organisms thrive, is that they're not content to just sit there with the information they have. They're information gathering machines. They're naturally exploratory. Some species obviously more than others, and we are probably the most exploratory. But those are things that you can naturalize that. You can formalize those ideas you can put those kinds of parameters into machine learning algorithms or machines that robots and so on, that have some degree of a measure of their own information and their own confidence in their decision-making capabilities. So kind of a metacognitive apparatus that is what can then drive curiosity and ultimately lead to the emergence of things like science.
Interesting. And do you think then, can we engineer free will?
It's a great question. I don't think our current systems have anything like agency because they're not designed to, right? They're not designed to keep themselves alive, to move around in the world. They don't, for the most part, causally intervene on the world. They're very passive. They get some input and they give some sort of output, but they're not doing anything in the world that would, first of all, be meaningful to them because they have to do it to stay alive. And secondly, allow them to infer causal knowledge of the world by causally intervening on it, right? If all they get is passive knowledge, they can get a picture of causality in the world based on, say, all the text on the internet, right? But they don't have the capacity to causally intervene themselves on the world and figure out what's going on in a way that would enable them to develop real intelligence, which is, at least in the natural world, typically defined in terms of adaptive action in uncertain or novel environments. So it's a problem-solving capacity that pays off in the guidance of behavior, right? That's what we recognize as intelligence, is the ability to do intelligent things, right? To behave intelligently in figure stuff out, right? Problem-solving, but in the service of action. So the current systems aren't like that, but there's no reason in principle that I can see why we couldn't design some principles that do have those kinds of parameters, that do have that way of interacting with the world, and that do have the cognitive control systems with the architectures that are knowable, that we're increasingly coming to know and understand, that could be instantiated in different kinds of hardware. I mean, we talked earlier about these abstract systems principles, where you could see, like I said, at the simple thing like an oscillator, you can do it in a genetic circuit or a neural circuit or an electronic circuit. To me, the functionalities are the important thing, and the nature of the relationship between whatever this entity is and the world. Those are the important things that would determine or entail whether it's an agent or not, and also thereby whether it can develop the kind of general intelligence that we see in animals and humans. Now, I'm not saying that's the only way to get to hyperintelligence. You can get hyperintelligent systems that just have a different architecture and a different way of doing things. That's fine. But I think to get to real general intelligence, you probably will need to make an intelligence. You'll need to make an entity that's an agent.
Okay. And so what do you think about the social impacts of this stance, that the free will does exist?
Yeah.
Do we need to change something like for
No,
the
it's funny.
betterment of the society?
It's funny. It's such a non-sensationalist conclusion, because actually I think we have very good understanding of free will, right? We have systems of moral and legal responsibility that are the basis of everything, the way that society works. And people often talk about this in the legal context, but just generally speaking, we take people to be responsible, we hold them responsible for their actions, because we have quite a good sense that what happens is up to them. But we also have, I think, a nuanced sense where we recognize, actually, this person did that because they were upset, and or they were hungry, or they didn't have the same degrees of freedom as somebody else. I think when we're sort of ascribing responsibility, some people more than others take these things into account, right? And so our systems recognize that some things are up to us, but that we don't have unlimited freedom. And our legal systems certainly recognize that. And they recognize that some people have more control than others, right? Adults have more control than children do. People who are drug addicts have less control than people who are not. People with psychosis have less control, and so on. People who are actively intoxicated or inebriated have less cognitive control. All of those things are, already reasonably well taken into account in our legal systems. So my feeling is that our thinking on this topic, what you could say the folk notions of freedom, free will, and moral responsibility are pretty good. And the one thing I would say is that you shouldn't listen to neuroscientists who say the latest fMRI experiment or EEG experiment proves that we have no free will, that you can undermine the sort of bedrock of our phenomenal experience with, with a few experiments in a lab somewhere. I just don't buy it. And so if anything, the message is we're doing okay. We're thinking we have quite sophisticated ways of thinking about these things already, and the reductive deterministic view to me is really nihilistic. It doesn't actually allow us to take into account people's circumstances and so on. If we say no one has any free will ever, then there's no sort of gradation of understanding how people's freedom can be limited. And it also means that we'd have no sense of investigating what it is in someone that's different in someone with, say, psychosis versus someone without. I mean, their control systems, first of all, their sense of self has been eroded, but also their control systems are impacted in ways that we can understand. But it makes no sense to even approach a science of that if we don't predicate that on the idea that people do have some control, right? And that's what we're talking about. That's the distinction that we're interested in investigating. So I think it's important, if you think about the question of free will, not just as this big metaphysical question, but as a much more concrete biological one, which is, what are these systems of neural control? How can we understand them? And how do they sometimes go awry in medically important ways?
Yeah, and let me ask you this. So since we were talking about degree of free will, right? So of course, at momentarily actions, or for all those momentarily actions, we can say that, there is free will. But let's say that if we take a period of time, 5-10 years or something, which for a teenager, it may be, like deciding a career, where to go, what to study, etc. What which people to choose. And for sure, for that period of time, it's combination of both, right? Like it's that sort of degree of free will, all the momentarily actions that we have taken, but it's also the combination of some sort of genetic predispositions, etc., or
all those factors,
cultural and social aspects.
All those factors feed into it, and I mean, and the interesting thing is that every decision that we make that has any long-term horizon is constraining our behaviors throughout that time horizon, right? So if when I decided to go to college, I was committing 4 years that of constraint, right? I was going to go, I was going to, stay in this place where I could go to this college. I was going to go to lectures at this time and this time, and I was going to do this work and so on. All of that was constraining my behavior. And it's the same thing when you have a job. It's the same thing when you get married, or you have children, or you make any kind of long-term plan. Even just going anywhere entails keeping going there, right? Otherwise we never get there, right? So what we have to have is these nested levels of control, where we say, okay, I have a long-term goal here. And in order to achieve that, right now, I need to be doing this, this, and this. I need to be sustaining these behaviors through time. So that's what I was sort of talking about earlier, this much richer view of guiding and managing our behavior in this nested hierarchy, where the top level goals are providing context to the lower level systems that control action very immediately in the world, right? So you could say that's constraint. It is, but it's useful context in the sense that if that didn't happen, we would never sustain a behavior towards any goal beyond a second or two, right? So that's where the power comes from. When we think about an organism making happen what it wants to happen, that's not just in the next second. It's not right now. I want this to happen right now. I'm going to make it happen. It's a year from now, 4 years from now. I want to get a good job. I want the future to be a future where I have a good job. So I'm going to go to college for these 4 years, right? So that's making the future be what you want it to be. Way, way far away. And humans have that capacity to think, as I said, almost indefinitely into the future. That's really one of the characteristics that distinguishes that line, right? That lineage of evolution, is that there's an increasing time horizon of cognition, which actually Mike Levin calls the cognitive light cone, which I like that idea. It just gets longer and longer along that lineage until you get to us, where it almost extends forever. At least we can think about those things.
Yeah. I mean, the reason why I raised that point is because I was thinking that, like, in that case, what can be our social goals? When we think of these kind of long-term goals, right? In that sense, are we doing good in terms of education system, or like social systems, like the way we are supporting people, etc.
Well, so there you get into really interesting aspects of conflicting goals, right? You get into sort of economics and social psychology and so on. That on the one hand is amazing, because we've been able to create these incredible civilizations through collective action, and that collective action necessarily involves the subjugation of personal goals for collective good, right? That we all share in. And that's partly, there's a pro-social aspects to that have been selected for. And in fact, a lot of our moral judgments are really judgments about whether someone has behaved in an antisocial way or not. They're putting their own goals above everybody else's, or they're considering their own sort of moral standing above everybody else's. Those are the things that engender moral outrage, and that our moral systems are built around. Both promoting pro-social behavior, but also promoting long-term behavior, right? Because impulsive behavior is bad for the collective. And so many of our collective goals are longer term. So individuals have to be able to sort of not just keep their own goals, weight them a bit lower, but continue to do that through time to enable us to achieve collective goals. And of course, what happens is that within those dynamics, you get some different incentives that are competing with each other. You get cheating, you get these moral systems that we've built up that can be hijacked. They're vulnerable to certain kinds of behavior. I mean, psychopaths in particular really take advantage of these systems. Not only that they behave immorally or amorally, they take advantage of the moral systems of the other people in society. Right? So, I mean, the most obvious pressing concern right now is climate change, the one that needs collective action, where almost all of the incentives are aligned against that goal, right? Where we have the systems of, well, frankly, the systems of capitalism, capitalist economies, incentivize individual companies maximizing their profits. They incentivize, when they corrupt political systems, they incentivize protection of those companies' interests and the laws that protect them, and so on. So there's a capacity for collective action. There's a capacity for, I guess, intelligent action on a planetary scale that I'm not sure we have, in fact, the collective social architecture in place that will enable us to enact that. I'd like to think that we do. I don't want to be a pessimist about the future, but at least I can say the fact that we have individual free will, we really do. Some things are up to us. And the fact that we have evolved as pro-social collective species, hypersocial, in fact, means at least that the existence proof is there. We could, right? We have the potential to act collectively to ensure the future of our planet. And I certainly hope that we will take that opportunity.
Yeah, so that means, like, at individual level, we do have free will, and at social level, people should stop thinking like octopuses and just come together as humans and kind of work for the progress of the humanity, right?
Yeah, and in a sense, we were talking about that hierarchy of goals and the sort of longer term frame, and the point is to just go out, go a level out of your own head, and there we have cultural, societal goals. And I think that's right. I mean, it's not just an analogy. I think that's really what happens where we can see, okay, well, the time frame is such that, or the scenario is such that over this time frame we can predict this is what's going to happen, and it's going to be bad for everybody. And then we have to just sort of convince everyone of that and get them to weigh that against the short-term goals that they will have, or say, okay, yeah, I can see that this vague abstract doom that's coming, but in the short term, I really want to drive my SUV, or I really want to do this or that, right? And so, yeah, there's that tension kind of, in a way, reflects tension within ourselves, right? But we have those systems in place to allow us to navigate those, and it's possible in principle that we could have that same sort of functional architecture on a global scale. It's just that political and economic systems right now are not aligned with that kind of an architecture.
Yeah. But hopefully, as you said, that you are not a pessimist, I am not a pessimist. So let's just go with some hope. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's new and what's next after free agents? I mean, I noticed that the consciousness bit was a little bit aside from your piece. I mean, what do you have any comments on that?
Well, I didn't go into consciousness too much because it's such a huge open area. It's funny if you think about it in terms of a control system.
Yeah.
Then you can ground questions of consciousness in terms of what is it good for?
Yeah.
And really, I think it's that metacognition, self-awareness kind of thing. Like, it's not just that I'm having thoughts, I'm aware of having thoughts. I can think about those thoughts, I can reason about those reasons. That gives a kind of a more powerful level of cognitive control. You can think about certainty and confidence. You could think about whether it was a good reason to have or not, right? So it's another level of judgment, which just pays off in a control system. But it also, in a sense, avoids the infinite regress of thinking you've just got this hierarchy that just goes up and up and up and up and up, and then, but where does it stop, right? It doesn't keep going up, it goes back down again. So it's a reverberating kind of architecture, and I think that's a much more satisfying, natural way of thinking about it. It doesn't result in an immaterial mind or a spirit that's free floating somehow, right? It's much more of this recursive kind of architecture. So there, I think those aspects of consciousness can be talked about in a naturalized kind of a way, right? You could even think about building systems that have that functional architecture to them. The bit that I find really hard to talk about in consciousness is why it feels like something, right? There's aspects of phenomenal consciousness, which a lot of the debates are about. Why do phenomenal experiences exist at all? If you just built a robot with this kind of architecture, would it feel like something to be the robot seeing something, or would it just be effectively seeing it? And those are very, very difficult questions to answer. It felt like if I got into them, it would be another book entirely.
Yeah.
But actually, in terms of like next projects, that might feel like a logical way to go, but it's not where I'm going. And I actually just don't feel qualified to do that. So I want to go back the other direction, almost back to genetics and development. And what I'm thinking about these days is how the form of an organism is encoded in the genome. The basic question of developmental biology and genetics, really.
Yeah.
And we have various ways of thinking about that are not very satisfactory, like a blueprint, of the organism. Well, it isn't. Or a program that sounds like a computer program that's not quite right. So I want to think, what is a good way to think about that? And on one level, it's very hardcore molecular biology and development, but on another level, it taps into these ancient philosophical questions about preformation versus epigenesis, the idea that the form of the organism is there already, it's pre-packaged somehow into the fertilized egg, or it emerges through development in a way, through interaction with the environment in some way. And those are ancient kind of divides. And I think there's some new science that might shed some light on those. So that's where I'm going next.
It's quite interesting. I mean, on one aspect, it's so with this book, you are mainly talking about some sort of it's mostly qualitative properties of organisms, and the in the other case, it's more like hardware, you know.
Yeah,
So in that perspective, it's quite interesting. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Okay,
most
so
definitely.
all the best, and thank you for doing this. Thank you for accepting the invitation. This was a great conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it, both
Yeah,
your
great.
book and the conversation. So thank you
Thanks
so
a lot.
much. Yeah.
Cheers. Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you.